Live from FABSCRAP's headquarters in the Bach Building in South Philadelphia, it's Grit Alive, where the story comes to the stage. Tonight, we'll be talking textile recycling with three people who are making sure that your clothes are stylish and sustainable. And now for your host, a person who can make her own clothes, give a harp lesson, and progress the circular economy all in one day, Samantha Wittchen.
Thank you, Nick, for that kind introduction. I am thrilled to be here tonight to lead the conversation with three people who are working really hard to shift Philadelphia's textile system to a zero-waste circular one. To give some context, in 2017, the last time that the city of Philadelphia measured its residential waste, Philadelphians discarded 31,577 tons of textile waste. That equates to roughly about 40 pounds of textile waste for every man, woman, and child in Philadelphia. Tens of thousands of tons of clothing are discarded each year, many of which end up in places like the Atacama Desert, in Chile, and other locations throughout the global south, leaving this colossal waste problem for someone else in one of those locations to deal with. Luckily, here in Philadelphia, there is a growing network of individuals and organizations that are working really hard to shift our textile system to a zero-waste circular one. And tonight we're going to be hearing from three individuals that are profiled in this month's Grid magazine cover story and who can help us kind of break down how do we manage to get to a zero-waste circular textile system in Philadelphia. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our three panelists to the stage with me, and we will get started. So I'd just like to take a moment to introduce you to all our panelists that we have here. Directly to my left is Lindsey Troop, and Lindsey is the regional manager for FABSCRAP here in Philadelphia. She runs the operations right here where we are seated tonight. Thank you so much for hosting us. Lindsey joined FABSCRAP in 2019 after seeing the colossal amount of textile waste that was produced by the fashion industry during her work doing styling and merchandising in the fashion industry. She is also an at-home sewist and is very welcoming to anybody who wants to come here and check out the amazing textiles that FABSCRAP has to offer to the public. Next is Rachel Mednick. Rachel Mednick is a Drexel and Moore College of Art and Design professor, and she is also a tireless advocate for circular fashion here in Philadelphia. She leads the Textile Recycling Task Force as part of her role at All Together Now, Pennsylvania, and also is in charge of the Garment and Textile Task Force for the City of Philadelphia, something along those lines. But she is, again, a tireless advocate for circular fashion and for coming up with a better way to do things here in Philadelphia. Next to Rachel is Jordan Haddad. Jordan is one half of the brother-sister team that runs Lobo Mau, which is a zero-waste, slow fashion brand here in Philadelphia. All of the things that they produce are in with a zero-waste mindset. They do not produce any waste in the process of designing the clothing. And a little extra fun fact, Jordan is also in a band called Flight School, and he is a singer and plays the guitar for them. So welcome to all three of you, and we really are excited to talk about textile waste and the solutions that we can find to it here in Philadelphia. So I'd like to kick off the conversation a little bit just talking about what exactly happens to our textile waste and what happens to not just the clothing that we discard after we're done wearing it, but what happens to the textile waste that actually gets produced in the process of making that clothing to begin with. So one of the preconceptions that a lot of people have is that when you donate or get rid of one of your articles of clothing, that it gets actually recycled and say you have a sweater that you donated and it gets turned into a new sweater. Unfortunately, that is not really the case. And that perception definitely plays into people feeling like it's not such a bad thing to be buying clothing, and then if I have a place to donate it, it's definitely going to get recycled. So I'd like to open up the conversation, talk about what does actually happen to your clothing by talking to Lindsey a little bit about the textile waste that they deal with here. And I should point out that the textile waste that they deal with here is before it gets turned into clothing. So it is the waste that gets generated in the process of making your clothing. So Lindsey, if you could just kind of step us through a little bit about what happens when the waste comes in here and how you manage it and then where it goes at the end, that would be great.
Yeah, of course. So we at FABSCRAP take care of what we call pre-consumer waste, which is waste that gets made in the production and development of clothing, home textiles, and things like that. So pre-consumer waste is unique because it's widely unregulated, and while most cities have clothing donation and post-consumer places for drop-off, like Sam was talking about, and like Sam's statistics in the beginning, there's some, if not great, data on the amount of post-consumer waste and clothing that is thrown out in cities. There's basically no data on pre-consumer waste. So that is really the hole that FABSCRAP is trying to fill, working directly with clients and designers, brands, home sewers, people who are creating the clothing. We are taking what doesn't get made into clothing. So that is from the tiniest scraps to bolts of fabric that they may be over-ordered, or that product didn't end up going into production. Things happen. So there's a lot that falls into that category. Again, we're creating the data. There's been a large hole, but it's estimated that the post-consumer waste for every pound of clothing made can be up to 40 times. So it's a wide problem, and we're taking that and we sort through it here at Philly and in our New York warehouse. We're sorting out by fibers, but like you mentioned, fiber-to-fiber recycling technology is a dream, and it's in process, but it's not there yet. So I have an example of what happens to what we recycle. This is shoddy. So when we say we took in something, it wasn't reusable, we recycled it, we have shredded it into this material. It is kind of an alternative to polyfill for home sewers who can use it for pillows and stuffed items, but industrially it's used in housing installation, it's in carpet padding, moving blankets. So it's got some good uses, but it is a downcycling structure.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking us through that. So you were talking a little bit about that this is the product of when you've basically taken all the stuff here that that's reusable and you can resell and send it out into the world. Again, this is all the else that cannot be reused or resold, and it ends up going to a shredder. Right, and this is the end product of that. Can you talk a little bit about just the fact that you've got a shredder that you use, but we know through our research that there are not many in this area. And so, FABSCRAP has a shredder that they work with, but then the next closest one is in North Carolina. So can we talk a little bit about, what that means for being able to get to textile circularity here in the region?
Very hard to come by actual textile recycling tech in the US. So that is a hole that we would love to see grow. If we're talking about funding for textile recycling, I think tech is like the first thing that needs to be tackled. We need these facilities here and accessible, preferably like government funded, so they're accessible to everyone and regulated. We get the data, we know what is actually happening in life. The shredder that we have, is like a prized commodity. Very rare, we're very lucky. But the fiber-to-fiber technology is something else. Like those are different recycling facilities. So to turn cotton fabric back into cotton yarn, that's a whole different tech field, and wildly underdeveloped, I would say, at this moment in the US.
Rachel, I know that you know a decent amount about fiber-to-fiber recycling. Could you talk a little bit about how that works and what some of the challenges still are with that?
Yes, absolutely. Lindsey kind of framed that up really nicely to start the process, but we really need to be able to identify what our fibers are. Most of our clothing nowadays is actually blended fibers, which complicates this issue significantly. So in order to get back like a cotton yarn, if you're starting with just a cotton t-shirt that's 100% cotton and isn't mislabeled, as most things are also mislabeled undergarments, then it sets you up for better success. But we really don't have the technology available to us just yet to be able to do that on a mass scale as we really need it. And we also need to consider that we need to reduce our consumption first. And that's really an important part of this. I think sometimes people hear textile recycling and they think, oh, I can just like put it in a bin. I can buy as much as I want and I can just keep donating it and it goes somewhere good. But that's not what happens. And we really need to reduce the amount of clothing that we're putting into this cycle to begin with, from a business perspective of overproduction and a consumer perspective of overconsumption. And once we get into the recycling level, that's like really meant for the last pieces of the puzzle that cannot be rehomed, that cannot be reused, and that's where we can address that. But before we can even get into that, we have to sort. And so that's something that there is a little bit of tech that we're seeing. There's kind of sorting guns that you can scan and it will tell you what the fabric content is. So we are getting there and making steps in the right direction, but we still have a long way to go because things need to be sorted. Well, first of all, collected, sorted, and then turned back into fiber. And we also need to consider, who's paying for this? Or we're trained as customers to think that we just put our recycling out on our stoop and that, it's just free. But it's not. You're actually paying with it with your tax dollars. But this is, again, just kind of retraining all of our mindsets to think about, someone needs to pay for this in order for it to be successful.
Yeah, so I'm hearing you talk about a bunch of different places where this whole situation can kind of break down. The ideal situation that I think a lot of people have in their minds is that I take this piece of clothing and I donate it, and then it ends up getting actually recycled and turned back into another piece of clothing. But what you've just kind of described is a lot of spots where this can kind of break down, in that there are technological limitations to doing that. There are issues with mislabeling of garments, so that even if you have the correct technology, you don't necessarily know that that garment is suitable to be used for that technology. And so we really need to be thinking about shifting our mindset about what we're doing and how we're producing this waste, and can we reduce it to begin with in the first place. Which leads me to ask Jordan about their efforts at Lobo Mau to reduce waste in their own production processes, and speak to maybe some of the new things that you're doing and thinking about as far as how you take that a step further.
Sure. So when we first started, we were always making small batch, slow fashion before we knew it was slow fashion. We were chiefly working with dead stocks. We knew, there was a great purpose for these fabrics that were either going to be incinerated or landfilled. If it's the wrong shade, they trash it. Really nice designer fabrics. That's how we started making clothing. And then it sort of snowballed as we started to learn more about sustainability and a lot of the negative effects of fast fashion. We started to evaluate each year what we could do to be more sustainable. And we started printing our own textiles using organic inks, faced with the decision of whether we're using plastisol inks versus organic inks. Plastisol inks have petroleum base; those leach into your waterways and such. So that was a good movement. And then after that, we started thinking, well, okay, we love our fabrics. We've been saving them for a long time for sentimental value, and not knowing how to dispose of these production runs that we had. If you cut out X amount of shirts, we have that surrounding area of fabric that would be trashed or landfilled. So we were saving all of these scraps, and we have an 1,800 square foot facility in the Bach building where we are now, neighbors with FABSCRAP, and these bins just started piling up, and we were thinking, my gosh, okay, this is like a really tangible kind of like microcosm or view of what is happening out there in the world. We need to start thinking about, yes, okay, so we are making our clothing we're making an impact in some sustainable ways, organic cottons and developing fabrics in the US, manufacturing here, small batch manufacturing, working with local factories and such. But what happens after that? So I had to take us on the journey for a bit. So I actually brought what we're working on now as we experiment with ways to be more circular as a company. This is a zero-waste pillow filled with shoddy, as Lindsey was describing earlier. This is FABSCRAP shoddy, and this wavy motif was featured in our last fall collection. We saved some fabric, and of course, you see it here. This is dead stock cotton that was printed in our studio. So all this is machine washable, and of course, we're looking at different applications to shred down our pre-consumer waste.
Can you just explain for a moment, for the benefit of the audience, what dead stock is? I know we've mentioned that term a couple times, but I'm not sure that everyone is familiar with that.
Yes, sure. So dead stock is fabrics that designers and big companies will have made for them, custom made for them. A lot of times they're made of, like what we were talking about earlier, they're a mix of different fibers, polyesters, nylons, cottons, which have their own host of problems when they need to be downcycled or refibered. Dead stock is that fabric that didn't sell, that would have been, let's say the company ordered thousands and thousands of yards and only ended up using a small percentage of that or X amount of that. The quickest solution, the cheapest solution is just to trash it, burn it. And there are various jobbers out there now that just because of the sheer volume of fabric that's being created can resell these fabrics, and they're perfectly good. There are some caveats, like sometimes we don't know what's in them, what they're made of, and our own experimentation has to go into that. And we love working with dead stock. We still incorporate it today, but we also have started, designing our own fabrics as well.
Great, thanks, Jordan. I think that this is a great transition to one of the next things that we wanted to talk about, which is that there is this issue of mixed fiber content fabrics, and we are seeing more and more of them in our clothing, right? And so it would be helpful, I think, for the audience to understand a little bit about fiber content and the different kinds of fibers, and determining what fibers are in certain things, certain clothes that they buy, and which ones present more of an issue from an end-of-life perspective. So I will let whichever one of you wants to take that, go ahead.
Assuming I'm taking that one. So I think there's a few, I'm going to try and just simplify this a little bit, but basically there's natural fibers or not natural fibers, and natural fibers come from an animal or from a plant, and the rest of the stuff for the most part is made out of fossil fuels, which is plastic. And so whenever you can, you want to look for garments that are made with natural fibers. So it's always good to look at your labels. That's really important. As we did say, it is a problem that we do have in the industry. The best thing to do is to shop from small brands, because typically they're doing their research, and in my findings, they're usually much more honest than the bigger brands are. So small brands are always great to support, looking for things like 100% cotton or 100% linen, 100% wool, different things like that. All of those fibers will biodegrade naturally. So after you are done with them, they're not causing as much havoc in a landfill as, say, a pair of jeans are that include spandex. Spandex is probably the worst thing, because we can't, I'll let Lindsey speak on this in a second also, but we really can't do anything with it. Once there's spandex in something, it's kind of there forever and can take hundreds and hundreds of years to decompose. It's also important to consider how we wash our clothing, because when we wash our clothing, if it's not made out of natural fibers, we're releasing microplastics into our waterways every time we wash our clothing. And we're finding scientists are finding plastics now in everything, including plants, because plants are absorbing water with microplastics. So it's quite terrifying. And it's only really been getting worse because in order to keep costs down on fabric, we're seeing a lot more and more blends. So you always want to look for 100% fiber content whenever you can. Natural fibers are always the way to go. If you don't own anything linen, it's a magical fabric, and I highly suggest that you try it out.
Yeah, I would love to jump in there. So some data that FABSCRAP has been able to collect in our operations, we do sort by fiber as much as we can, and out of all the fabric we've collected, which is almost 1 million pounds in the last 5 years, 60% is blended with no spandex. 31% is blended with spandex. 6% of what we take in has been 100% cotton. I think it's 3% that's been 100% polyester and 1% that's been 100% wool. So those are our category breakdowns that FABSCRAP's seen, but it's a real eye-opener. I mean, this is the pre-consumer waste, but it's what designers are using. It's what's being made into your clothing. So it's a real industry standard for what is being used, and it's heavily blended materials, which presents a whole new facet of problems when you go to recycle it. So there's a real understanding there. Spandex, I could spend hours on spandex. Spandex specifically, why it's such a problem, and it comes up in FABSCRAP daily, is we have to sort anything with even 1% spandex out because it can't be recycled. And when we say that, going back to the shoddy process where we shred material into this, it can't go through that process. That's machinery that uses high heat. Spandex is essentially plastic. It melts, it gums up the machinery. It can't go in. So any of those blended fabrics we have to pull out, and we have to find a new use for. And there's no tech to recycle spandex yet. Fingers crossed, that would be great developments. But until then, we're rehoming it. And that's easy if it's a yard of fabric or 20 yards of fabric. That's really difficult when it's a tiny scrap that came off a production line. So FABSCRAP's doing the best we can. We sell scrap fabric, scrap spandex. We have bins of it. We color sort it. We'll pack it up and send it online if you want to buy it. There's been a patchwork revival that's really been very useful. My mask is made out of patchwork spandex. So there's a lot of creative people who are doing really creative things with it, which is great. But it's not a solution. It's not long-term. It's not sustainable in its essence, just for longevity. So it's got to be thought about. And yeah, that's the short of my spandex rant.
So, what I'm hearing from this is that this is confusing. I mean, this is something that it's confusing, and it's difficult to kind of always assess what your clothes are made out of and be sure that you're necessarily getting what you think you're getting. And we're all people that are in this, right? And so I think Rachel touched on a little bit, but when you're a consumer, what can you do to try to do the right thing and to try to understand this a little better, so that that you're not necessarily contributing to the problem as much as contributing less to this problem.
Am I doing this one? So there's lots you can do as a consumer, and I think what Sam said is really important, is that it is confusing. So small steps are the way to start here. Nobody expects you to have complete understanding of this if you're not in the industry, and even if you are in the industry, this is confusing. And a lot of this information is new information that we're learning more and more about every day. So I think the first thing is buy less. Don't buy as much. Just stop it. Just don't do it. Only buy what you really, really need. And before you decide to buy something that you really, really need, see if you can find it secondhand or vintage. That's always the best way to go, for sure. Beyond that, look for natural fibers, shop small brands. If you're ever confused by a brand's website, which happens all the time, it's something called greenwashing. It's a way to market to you to seem like the brand is sustainable when it might not be. The best thing that I always advise people to do is to call customer service and ask questions. If a brand is forthcoming with their information, they're willing to share it, they're a wide open book, they're honest about where they are and what they're working towards, that's a brand you can typically trust. And again, it's not 100%, but for the most part, that's true. So I think starting with those steps is a great way to go. And again, just really thinking about like, what can you borrow from a friend or what can you rent? Like places like Rent the Runway or Nuuly, or there's so many rental programs out there now. Like don't buy a dress that you're gonna wear one time to a wedding and never wear again. Just like, don't do it. It doesn't make any sense. It's gonna take up space in your closet. You're not gonna know what to do with it. It's gonna annoy you in the long run. So we have so many options now, I think, that make it easy from that perspective, or borrow from a friend. If you really start to just take a step back and think about how you can reduce your own consumption, it will challenge you to reach out and think about how you shop in a different way. And it's also good for your wallet. So win, win, win.
I have something to add to that. We also, we make new clothing, and that's something that, we think about now as we're putting new clothing into the world. That's a conscious decision to think about. So we encourage people, and it may sound counterintuitive, to shop less as well. So our price points are really reflecting what it takes to make this clothing in the U.S., not only make it in the U.S., but also source sustainably and source in the U.S. and try to do it sustainably. So I think if we can all really understand what goes into making clothing, where it comes from, the resources, but also the social implications of like work environments and such, fossil fuels it takes to ship fabric from one country to another for a warehouse to sort through, for them to ship to you, for you to return it, to ship back to a warehouse. I mean, it's insane. We just really need to be more mindful about how often we're purchasing. So fast fashion companies have gotten really good at convincing us, what's the latest style and trend. If you're looking for companies that are less focused on trends and more focused on classic silhouettes, something that is an investment, it's an emotional tie to that piece of clothing, something you could see opening your closet 10 years from now. Hell, if you have kids and they open it someday and they're going to a party and they open the closet and they want to wear like this piece that you wore when you were their age. That's more towards the direction we should be going. We don't need to buy a shirt, like Rachel said, for an evening and wear it once. I don't know what the statistic is now, but at one point, the average amount of times you wear something is like 7 times or something before it goes to donation or hence a landfill. So.
Can I just add one other piece to that as well? I think Jordan brought up a great point in really keeping those investment pieces. And that is something that I do hear a lot from people is like, well, shopping sustainably is more expensive. And in that regard, yes, but I hope that makes you pause and think about what you actually need and what you want to buy. The other thing I wanted to touch on, which you mentioned, is returns. People don't realize when you're returning things, a lot of times that it's more expensive for the company to actually process that return and put it back into their system. And so it actually ends up landfilled. So the best thing to do if you're unsure if something's going to fit you is to go to a store, try on the one size, get it if it fits you, or order one thing and not order 50 different sizes to try on at home. That's another layer of this that I don't think we've touched on. I don't know if you can speak to that, Lindsey.
Yeah, I would love to. That's a great point. And especially with an online shopping boom mean, there's been an online boom happening for 10 years, but then the pandemic really upped that. I previously worked in retail. I know and saw firsthand the amount of online returns we would get. And a lot of people online shop, they'll buy multiple sizes because they're going to return them. They want to try on a few and they're always going to return. Yeah, it's super problematic. And as FABSCRAP works with these brands and companies to deal with their pre-consumer waste, but we do get a lot of inquiries. Okay, now we have this mountain of returns. What are we supposed to do with this now? And then they get into proprietary issues, and there's a whole other thing. So it's a mountain that, yeah, I think is a really good point. So just being a little more conscious about what you're purchasing and what's happening to it. And then I would say, I mean, the longevity thing is a great point, and learning some mending and repair techniques will go such a long way. We teach a lot of like basic things like adding a zipper, sewing up a seam. Like those things can really add a lot of life to your items. So it's a really important step.
That's great. These are all really great strategies that I feel like consumers can kind of take to heart and think about as they're out there in the world. And I think Lindsey's last point really helps us start to think also, you know, we're talking a lot about the consumer's role in this, but really the industry has a huge role to play in stemming this problem of textile waste. And so I think it's worthwhile for us to spend a little bit of time talking about what's industry's responsibility and what's the fashion community's responsibility for this waste, and for again being accountable for it and taking responsibility for it.
Yeah, I think a lot of it. FABSCRAP, and Rachel touched on this a little bit, people don't think about the cost of recycling, but we're a recycling nonprofit. Like, there are operational costs involved that are steep. We have a service fee for our recycling service. So if you're a brand working with us and you want to recycle your fabrics with us, we do have fees that go involved with that. And we try to make them accessible and easy, but and we make them by pound, like per pound you're paying for what you're throwing out. So, but it's a way to hold the industry financially responsible for the waste they're creating. So if you're creating less waste, you have less service fees, and that kind of hopefully will incentivize people to think about it next season. Like, oh, we had to throw out a lot of that last season and it cost us. Like, we had to figure out what to do with it. And so next season they're gonna go, okay, wait, do we actually need to order this much? Like, do we actually need to produce this many pieces? And so hopefully that will see some change. And then legislation, I think, is like the big key part to get industry movement.
Yeah. Do you want to say something about this? Yeah.
Legislation,
yeah. So
we really need it, and we need to hold companies accountable. I think right now there are some things companies can do. You've probably seen take-back programs. A lot of companies are taking back their products if you want to give it back when you're done with it. However, we don't really have solutions for that, as we've previously discussed. So while that's a great step in the right direction, it's not the end step. And I think if we can really have laws in place that are holding businesses accountable for the waste that they're creating, that they have to find a positive solution for it, this whole process is going to move very quickly.
So one of the laws, speaking of the legislation, New York State has just introduced legislation to help with some of these issues, waste, but also climate impacts of fashion. And there's been introduced in New York State the Fashion Act, and this act applies to apparel and footwear companies with revenues of $100 million or more. And what it's going to require of them is that they map 50% of at least 50% of their supply chain. And this is from the farms that are producing the fibers that then get woven into fabrics, and then all the way through them shipping. So that they're required to map that supply chain, and then they are required to disclose where in that supply chain they have social and environmental impacts. So these are things like energy usage, water usage, the waste that they produce, what sort of wages they're paying. Are the people manufacturing their clothes operating in good conditions or not? All of that. And then they must make plans to reduce those numbers. They also must disclose their material production volumes by fiber or material, which is part of this act. And they are going to have 12 months to comply with the mapping and 18 months to comply with their plan for how they're going to reduce their impacts. And on the end of this, the enforcement side of it, not complying with this can carry up to 2% of their revenues in fines. So this is not inconsequential numbers. So I guess my question is around this kind of legislation. Is this something that we could pass in every state, and especially here in Pennsylvania where we're operating? And if so, how do people ask for this? How do we push our legislators to care about this and be interested in this?
Yeah, the New York Act is one that we were really excited about, with FABSCRAP's operations being in New York. I think there's a few key elements that make it extra exciting, specifically the fines for noncompliance. And I think there was something in there too. There's going to be a public list of noncompliance. So that's really great in terms of consumer education. So that's really exciting, but I think the hardest hurdle with legislation is enforcement. And I think financial incentive is really the quickest and only way to get industry movement. So I was excited for that inclusion. I think this is going to spur a lot of, it's going to have like a real effect on a lot of different things. Because I think when people start trying to comply, they're going to find a lot of problems. Supply chains are not transparent. So these companies that have to now trace them are going to run into that, and they're going to have to think about what factories they use and where they're getting fabric, and if they have to report what their fabric is, they're going to think about where they're getting it and what's making it. So it's all very exciting. I think it also leads to a lot of use for things like the Recycling Task Force, which we're all a part of, and organizations like FABSCRAP and the Resource Exchange, and local things that are happening in Philly already are going to be a real asset to governments that are trying to enforce these things, because we have data, we know what's being thrown out, we know where the holes in the system are and kind of where to fill those in. So I'm really hoping like the snowball effect of these legislations could really carry. Yeah, and I'd love to see it in Philly. I think it'll look different. Every state's going to have different production levels, different companies that are operating. And so something like the Recycling Task Force that knows what's happening in the area, which I think is where Philly has a real advantage. Like this community just coming into it this year with FABSCRAP, there's already so much movement and there's such like passion. And so like you've got a whole community that know what's happening here, and that could really be an educational source for government if they use it.
Absolutely. I want to add also, as consumers, ask your brands. If, just ask your brands, what are you doing with your waste? Like, where are your factories? Again, like I was talking about before, the brands that are actually working on this are going to be transparent with you. And the ones that are not, if they get enough of their customers asking for this stuff, they're going to have to make changes. So I think we can start kind of at that grassroots level as well. This also, as Lindsey mentioned, is no small feat for especially a large company. The tracking of this is a huge task. Like these companies are going to have to hire several people to specifically just be able to trace their supply chains. So I'm really excited as well. I think it's going to have a huge ripple effect, and I think we certainly can start to see this in different states play out. And I think it will be really interesting to see how this is really enforced and really challenges all these companies in New York. It'll be a great study to look at and see how we can enforce that here.
People ask us sometimes, a lot of times, who are your competitors? And I don't think about the designers in Philadelphia. They're our community. I think of bigger corporations in fast fashion, and I think sanctions like that and holding them accountable really helps level the playing field, because there are so many times where I'll feel a little dejected and think, why the hell am I doing this if it's so much cheaper and so much easier to do it elsewhere, faster and cheaper? Of course, you know, we have our morals and we have our convictions and we stick to our guns, but there are moments where you think, my gosh, like the odds are not in the favor of small businesses who are working so hard to be transparent and accountable, sustainable, and circular now. But I think Philadelphia, something I'm really excited about is the Zero Waste initiative. And I'm really excited to see the plastic bag ban taking place. That's a start. Is that actually in effect right now, or is it like in limbo? Or, and then also, Rachel talked about greenwashing a little earlier. Greenwashing, as terrible as it is, I don't condone it, but it shows that there's kind of an ideological shift happening. These companies feel pressured to say things that aren't true, or to say they're sustainable in a way that they're actually not. I think it shows that whatever pressures they're feeling, it's working, and we just need to keep going.
That's a really good point, that the fact that this is even being talked about, whether there's actually any action that accompanies it, really shows that this heightened awareness and consumers making demands is starting to get through to the powers that be to make a shift. I guess, are there other kinds of legislation, like we talked a little bit about this, the New York one as a model, are there specific kinds that you see here that would be particularly useful for us, like whether it's disclosure laws or other kinds of things? And like if you produce a certain amount of textile waste here in Philadelphia, you need to then recycle it, you know, that sort of a thing. Landfill bans, are these useful things? I'd like to hear your thoughts on these things.
Yeah, I think some transparency and some regulation on like waste auditing, reporting what happens to things. So, and this is recycling textiles, but it's recycling plastics, recycling paper. If we are sending our recycling somewhere expecting it to be recycled, then I think like as citizens of the city, like we should be able to know that it happened. Like we should like someone needs to, a lot of the recycling companies are privatized and they're very secretive, and there is really no proof that when you send a bunch of textiles to somewhere that they're actually getting shredded or whatever. Like we work with a shredder that we're lucky to know, and we see the end result, we take the end result back, but there's a lot that won't tell you what happens to it. They'll take it and they won't tell you, and you just have no idea. So regulation, I think on that end would be super helpful. And then just waste audit in general and more accessible public recycling.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think Lindsey hit all the points, and I think landfill bans as well would be really helpful. We really just have to reduce what's ending up in landfill. So I think there's many ways to do that, all the ways that you spoke about. I think tax incentives and auditing and just really tracking. I just want to be like mindful that we don't really even have the infrastructure set up to even handle this type of legislation quite yet. And while we definitely need movement in that direction, there are many steps that need to be taken to even really start to think about that in a realistic way.
I would love to add something to that point. A good example is, Sam, you mentioned there was a law put in place in New York City that if over 10% of your waste was textiles, you had to recycle it. That was a law that was put in place, I'm not sure when, but before FABSCRAP started operating. And before FABSCRAP was operating, there's no public textile recycling in New York. So they made a law, and it's a great law. If we could enforce it, that would be excellent. And now we're there, and we hope to be a resource for these brands trying to follow it. But to put a law like that in place before there's any infrastructure is a little crazy. And so I think that's kind of what I was trying to mention with the snowballing. Like, you're going to put these laws in place. You're going to find out real quick if we can do them, if people can comply. So it's interesting, but yeah, there's a lot of work and funding that has to go behind it.
And I just want to add, that's really where reducing consumption comes in. Like, that's where we are at right now as an industry. That is what we can control. That's what we can implement. That's really where we can create change, is by reducing consumption from a consumer level and from a business level, because we do not have the structures in place to give good options yet. And it's coming. We will get there. I want to stay positive about it, because like, it is happening, but it's not quite there yet.
Well, and it seems like there's another piece of this, which is the economics of it too. Who's going to pay for this infrastructure to be developed? Is it funded by the government? Is it private industry completely? If it is, then the economics need to work out that there's enough, supply and then demand for the end product of these, textile recycling facilities too. So there's that.
Yeah, I would say to that point, there's a lot of specifically fashion companies profiting off the problem that they're creating, the fast fashion companies, the big companies. So it's like, you can easily pinpoint who's gaining profits off of these, and I think they need to fund solutions.
Gotcha. Jordan, I wanted to let you speak about what you wanted to talk about.
Sure, I think this warrants multiple discussions. I feel like we're just getting started. But on legislation, a couple months ago, I had the privilege of meeting with Congresswoman Scanlon, and she was asking some small business owners what she wanted to hear from us, like what we need, what are some issues that we're facing. Attrition came up, and we also know student debt is such a hot issue right now. If we aren't going to touch at least, forgiving some portion of these student loans back, perhaps there can be a government incentivized program for companies that are doing good things environmentally or socially for their communities, to help a portion of the paycheck go to repaying that employee's student loans. There's a lot of competition for smaller companies now. Say somebody is super passionate about sustainability or circularity, but just can't make ends meet financially, and they go to a big company or a big competitor because it pays the bills. I won't take credit for this idea. This was Becky Davies, co-owner of Remark Glass, also located in the Bach building. That was her idea, and I loved it.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, that's a really great idea. And I think it's things like this that are these, creative ways that we can change policy and we can provide incentives. And also it manages to level the playing field then for the businesses that are doing this the right way and that are being responsible, and helps them to continue to operate and attract talent and all of that stuff in a way that they may be disadvantaged at the moment with, I think.
I just want to add too, a lot of studies have shown, I don't have exact statistics off the top of my head, but that it's actually more profitable for businesses to act in a sustainable way. But it is a total shakeup of their current supply chains and current strategies. Mm-hmm. So there is initial financial investment to make those changes, but it actually is more profitable in the end. So that's something just to also note.
Yeah. Well, I think as Jordan pointed out, we could continue to have a ton of conversations around this, but I wanted to shift a little bit so that we can take some questions that we have gotten over the course of this. And I also wanted to encourage people that if you have questions, to put them in the comments for the live stream, and we will try to answer what we can.
Well, the chat has been alive, well and good, and lots of going on in the chat. FABSCRAP, hopefully you're going to get some volunteers out of this, so people are very interested. But it kind of, there's a lot of hope in the chat. People are excited, but there is this kind of running theme of people being a little frustrated, or how are we going to, the insurmountableness of just fast fashion and people that just want this. So you did bring it up, but there have been some questions around how can the industry use technology to slow down fashion, and primarily around social media too. There's been things on even like Instagram or TikTok influencers kind of getting people to just shift this mindset and trend. So how do we address that from technology and even like a social media aspect?
I can start with that. First, I want to say we forgot to mention everyone please take our textile recycling survey, because that's a way that you can literally implement change right now in your pajamas in 5 minutes. Data. So please do that, because we really need data to figure out what our issue is in Philadelphia and then figure out how to solve it. So just want to mention that. As far as social media goes, this is a huge issue. We need more and more influencers to be talking about thrifting and sustainable fashion and wearing outfits over and over again. Like, I remember, this was a few years back now, but Kate Middleton wore the same dress twice. She was photographed in it twice, and it literally made the news. And this is something we need to see more of. I think celebrities and influencers have a lot of influence, obviously, over what we see, and we need to see more repeated outfits. There's nothing wrong with that. And, you know, make it cool to wear your outfits over and over again, because you're not contributing harm to the environment.
Yeah, I think it's easy to feel a little overwhelmed or like to get a little negative, especially like you dig deeper, you learn more and more. I am really like kept afloat by the creativity. FABSCRAP's got a really nice community of makers and young designers and students who are using these materials in such interesting ways. And there's a lot of TikTok videos where people are home sewing and using scraps, and there's a lot of designers on Instagram, and if you can find them, follow them, because the creativity is really inspiring and really keeps you going, and is really like, oh, okay, there's a different fashion industry just waiting here if we embrace it and we invest into it. It's not like we're going to lose fashion. No, there's like a whole different world that's operating already. We just need to like bring it up.
Just to add one other thing to that too, limits make you more creative. So for anyone who wants to tell me that they have to like buy that one top to make a new outfit, you are not a creative person then, I'm sorry. So like, just, that was mean. I didn't mean to say I didn't mean that. But I actually really learned this. I worked in menswear for a little bit, and menswear is pretty limited. And it was amazing to me how many different things we could come up with just a button-down shirt, some kind of tie or a bow tie, and a blazer. And let me tell you, there's really endless options. So I think looking at it as a challenge too, and like seeing how creative you can be, see how you can style yourself. That's where you can use social media, look to get the idea, and then see how you can implement that from your own closet or borrowing from a friend.
Great. Yeah, we have Nancy Nigel from Gaffney Fabrics was on and saying, you know, apart from shredding, fabrics being cut into strips and used as yarn, and kind of goes along with that creativity that you were just talking about. So maybe if you guys could, I know we were talking about the fast fashion, the people that just want the thing that they're going to throw away real quick and kind of trying to, you know, counteract that. But what are you all saying, just like kind of making people more creative and engaging with your businesses?
I have
Prop
another prop. Thanks, Rachel. So I'm so happy this person asked this wonderful question. So right now we're experimenting with ways to chain stitch long, skinny pieces of our production remnants. We ask our factories to save all of our production remnants. Thanks so much for holding this. And chain stitch them together to tuft this floor mat. So you can see some of our we screen print our textiles too, so you can see our inks coming through, our print coming through here. This ended up saving about somewhere around 300 to 350 yards of clothing strips. It's super labor intensive, but the challenge was super rewarding, and it's empowering to come up with different ways to save fabric and keep it out of landfills. This is something that we'll be getting into as well as the brand diversifies.
Also, we're seeing lots of visible mending. If you want to do a quick Google on visible mending, you'll find lots of options and resources. And that's another way you can use these kind of strips or smaller scraps of fabric, is to make really cool patchwork or embroidery on your clothes. And Altogether Now is going to have a workshop about that in the beginning of March.
I should mention, I just forgot, this is something that you can do at home. You can purchase these tufting guns, and there's a place in Philadelphia, Tuft to the World, Tim Eads. Check it out on Instagram. You can make these at home.
Yeah, and
Sorry.
FABSCRAP has a whole section of clothing called mendables. That's a whole another stream of waste that's being created in the fashion industry, is production and sample garments. So it's not even worn clothing. It's literally clothing that was used in the design process. I'm actually wearing a piece that I visibly mended and patchworked the back. And we I feel like that's a lot of creativity. It's like, oh, I have this shirt and the sleeve was cut off for no reason. All right, what am I gonna do? Like, how am I gonna make a new sleeve, or what fabric am I gonna use? It's really fun to see what people kind of create. So yeah, definitely get creative.
Now, it seems that there's some reimagining in that creativity. So another question that was in the chat was around this idea of like reskilling and having people, changing the mindsets of the people that are actually making the clothes, whether they're small scale producers or larger scale, working in factories. So what are some thoughts on that, or what are you seeing in industry trends around reskilling?
That's a big one.
You go first.
It's a little worrisome sometimes because we all know skilled trades and trades are not as present as they used to be. One of the factories that we work with, the owner was telling me stories. He grew up in South Philly. He would wake up in the morning and see droves of people walking to work, and these were factory workers, machine operators. We really think that if we keep doing this and kind of focus inward on these self-reliant communities, that this could come back. So that's what we're hoping. Philadelphia used to be a very, very big textile town, and thanks to FABSCRAP and companies like you guys, it could be on the rise again.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I think also we just need to think about how we design in every step of the design process differently. There are a lot of resources now. Students that are coming out of schools now are typically well-versed in zero-waste pattern design, in different fabrics, in sustainability. I notice a huge difference for my students even from 3 years ago to now. Their knowledge base on this is huge comparatively. So I think that's a big part of this as well, and we're getting newer people into the industry that know how to do this kind of stuff.
And I just think it could really easily tie back into some of the legislation and like government funding we're talking about. If we're seeing a shift towards local production and then we want to move factories into the area and notice that we need a labor force, then maybe there's incentives for going to a trade school and taking a local job. And so I think it could tie back in really easily. So I think that like on an industry level is what I see happening, and I think on a just community like level with home sewers, there's been such a resurgence in learning some skills, learning to sew. There's a lot of great schools in Philly, like Butcher's Sew Shop, that teach sewing lessons. So I think also individuals can just learn skills for their own life too.
Made Institute, another
Made Institute, yeah. There's a lot of great resources in Philly.
And I think you read our mind, Lindsey, on that last question, or the last question from the audience here. It's a perfect segue. When you talked about the legislation, there was a question specifically about how receptive people were in the industry to the New York law, but also, the concern that companies with proprietary information, confidential relationships, might have an issue with sharing and disclosing. And you guys are a great example of collaboration up here. So how can the industry get over that and really work as one with that in mind and follow these laws?
I will say that's where I see a huge drastic change in the industry as well, in a positive direction. I know I owned a brand for about 10 years, and when I first started, it was literally impossible for me to find a factory, and I had to hire a consultant that was very well connected in order to find that. Nowadays, there's so many resources and there's so much more transparency, and I think that businesses are finally catching on to the idea that if we all help each other, everybody gets helped. And if we all work together, especially from the small business perspective, the more business we can provide our small factories, we can pay workers fairly. We can keep them in business. So it really is just a mindset shift about working together, and we're absolutely going to have pushback on this. 100%, because there are some businesses that want to keep it a secret and want to keep it to themselves. But when we're talking about sustainability, that's not a mindset that's going to help anyone.
We're out of time. with that.
Yeah,
Totally.
we are.
No time to keep secrets anymore.
Well, and I think that's a good segue because we are actually out of time. So I just wanted to take a moment and thank our three panelists here for being willing to have this really great conversation that we've had tonight. I want to thank all of you who joined via the live stream for joining. Hopefully you learned a few things and you have a few takeaways that you can help move us further in this direction of textile circularity in Philadelphia. So again, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for being with us, and we'll see you for the next one.